Hello, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Colin McMichael, and I'm the Education Coordinator at Treefolks. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the dynamic forests of Central Texas. Today I'm not going to be talking exclusively about urban forestry. Instead, I'm going to be taking a bit of a step back so we can look at the larger picture of forests in Central Texas. Since that is a rather large picture, I decided to break it down into some time periods that make it easier to talk about. Here I've broken it down into before humans arrived in Texas, after the first people began to settle, after the European colonization, and the future of forests. Before people got to North America, our forests were predominantly ruled by abiotic factors. The presence of forests is always dictated by water. With very little precipitation, an area would be a desert. Add a tiny bit more rainfall and you get a grassland. One minute smidge of rainfall more and suddenly there are trees. Keep adding rain and you get trees until the soil becomes overly saturated. And even then, there will often be trees with big buttress roots and other adaptations to wet soil. We're pretty obviously on the drier end of that scale. In fact, in Central Texas, we really straddle what is called the dry line that prevents a lot of forests from marching west. Since Central Texas straddles this line, we can grow trees here, but our trees tend to be a lot shorter than trees pretty much anywhere else. Going to forestry conferences around the country and saying you're from Texas gets plenty of eye rolls and comments about how nice our bushes are. But while they might be short, we do have some rather hefty trees. Honestly, we used to have a lot more though. Back before people, and as long as rainfall was adequate, the next biggest challenges to forests came from events like fires, strong winds, and floods. These are all things we call disturbances. There are a lot of other types of disturbances, but this pretty much nails down the abiotic ones. Disturbances aren't wholly bad since value is a human construct, but they do often take communities back a few steps in succession. Succession is the stages through which habitats go when they are developing. After a disturbance, succession gets knocked back to a previous point, and it starts climbing back to equilibrium. That equilibrium is commonly called a climax community, or an old-growth forest. This is characterized by very, very old trees, surrounded by trees of many different age classes. Between them is often a lot of coarse woody debris. The undergrowth, the trees, and the woody debris all make the humidity in these environments significantly higher than outside the forest. This makes a plant's life much, much easier. Here in Central Texas, we have 4 distinct forested climax communities that can form. The first is the upland hardwood assemblages. These can be quite variable depending on where they are, but are most commonly oak-elm forests. Since these are upland forests that experience drought often, they are more open woodlands that tend to have heightened diversity. The second is the upland coniferous assemblages. There are really only 2 options for these in Central Texas, and they are both juniper woodlands. The first and most common is the ash juniper woodland found to the west of Austin in the hill country. The second, the eastern red cedar woodland, is found to the east of Austin. Both create dense monocultures and a toxic soil that suppresses growth in other plants. Growth suppression helps the junipers because it prevents a lot of fires. However, the edges of these habitats can be quite diverse, generally due to more sunlight and less allelopathy in the soil, which is when junipers alter the soil composition to prevent seeds from germinating. There is a third coniferous assemblage, the lost pines, but this is only found near Bastrop, Texas. This is a very ancient remnant ecosystem and is not nearly as much of a monoculture as the juniper woodlands due to a less dense canopy. You can find a lot of East Texas flora in the lost pines, as they seem to have all gotten lost together. The third forest type is the riparian hardwood assemblages. These are less variable than the upland hardwood assemblages, mostly due to the more constant nature of water availability in riparian systems. The most commonly found trees in this forest type are the ashes, elms, and hickories. Black willow and cottonwood are extremely common too. These forests are tall, dense, and extremely productive. The fourth and final forest type is the least common. It's another riparian assemblage, but this is a coniferous assemblage. In central Texas, we have a lot of remnant populations from when conditions were different. Bald cypresses still line our creeks and rivers, which indicates that Texas was likely a lot wetter in ancient history. These stands are often a bit of a monoculture when it comes to the trees, but the forb and understory diversity can still be quite high, since the high canopy and ample water allows for more vegetative growth. Once a community reaches equilibrium, it becomes much more resistant to disturbances. This is due to the heightened diversity in most climax communities, and that heightened diversity is nothing more than the echo of previous disturbances. So disturbance builds diversity, and diversity buffers against disturbance. We are going to talk about this more in a bit, but I don't want to get too deep into the intermediate disturbance hypothesis just yet. The disturbances seen by the forests of Texas before people were likely from fires generated by lightning strikes, wind generated from storms, and floods generated by rivers overtopping their banks. In severe instances, all trees would be lost from the stand. This begins succession all over again with the regeneration or stand initiation phase. In the case of intermediate disturbance, it would only get knocked back a few steps since only a few trees are lost. This results in something called gap dynamics. But then the greatest disturbance of all arrived: people. People seem to have settled in Texas around 15,500 years ago. That is a long time ago, especially if you consider that this is 3 times as far back as the creation of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The oldest known habitation site here in Texas is actually here in central Texas. Up north of Austin in Salado, Texas, there's an archaeological site along Buttermilk Creek with evidence of mammoth hunting and trade with far western populations. I actually found the stone tools in this first picture about 5 miles south of that site in Florence, Texas, on my parents' ranch. Most of the other images I have in this talk relating to indigenous culture are going to be of the Caddo and Tonkawa people. They were not the original inhabitants of Texas that were hunting mammoth along Buttermilk Creek, but instead probably moved into Texas a few hundred to 1,000 years before Europeans arrived. The Caddo range extended only as far west as the escarpment when the Europeans colonized the area. They had extensive settlements, agriculture, and an established urban lifestyle. The inhabitants of the Edwards Plateau proper were the Tonkawa people, a nomadic tribe of buffalo hunters with limited agriculture and light settlements. We have a much better understanding of the Caddo way of life than many indigenous cultures of this area, and the basics were not that different from our own societies. On the right side, there are examples of a timber and grass Caddo house and a timber and hide Tonkawa teepee. The presence of people really began to change how the landscape looked. The biggest change was that fires became a lot more common. However, this period of interaction between people and forest went on for so long that the forest actually developed a new equilibrium or climax community. When the first people to settle Texas arrived, they changed how the stand dynamics played out in the forests. As mentioned previously, early inhabitants of Texas were not loose bands of early hominids sleeping in the bushes and combing the ground for food. They were people, humans like you or me. They arrived in nomadic tribes, but then they lived in settlements. They had agriculture, they cooked their food on fires and burn middens. It's really the arrival of people that you can point to as the beginnings of urbanization. Urbanization at this scale was not as detrimental to the environment as it is today, but that is mostly a function of density. Urbanization was also a cause of a lot of the fires that began to become common. Cooking fires were essential, but in Texas, drought is common. We have burn bans today, but back then, sometimes the fires escaped their confines and became uncontrolled. On top of this, the people would occasionally set fire deliberately to vegetation to flush game, clear land, or create better, more open hunting habitat. Trees also became utilized as a natural resource. Fuel is obvious with the need for fires, but people also used trees for buildings and tools. While this was not done on a scale at all similar to what we see today, this did represent a shift in the nutrient cycle of the forests. Suddenly, not every piece of vegetation that grew in the spot would decay in that spot. So with all those disturbances, you might think the natural world would have suffered a loss of diversity. In fact, the exact opposite appears to be the case. As I mentioned a bit earlier, there's something called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. This states that with intermediate levels of disturbance, ecosystems will see the highest levels of diversity. Both low and high disturbance results in suppressed diversity. It seems that before people got to North America, the disturbance regime was actually closer to what is labeled Roman numeral 1 in the graph, or low levels of disturbance. When the first people settled here, the disturbance regime with more fires pushed the ecosystem into the area labeled Roman numeral 2 on the graph, or intermediate levels of disturbance. Not to give away the ending, but I bet you can't guess which direction we keep moving once the Europeans arrive. With this intermediate disturbance regime, Texas became what is called a patchwork mosaic ecosystem. This is a system defined by multiple systems coexisting within it concurrently. Intermediate levels of fire and other disturbance created grassy areas where trees had yet to regenerate. These were surrounded by patches of land where regeneration had already taken place and other patches where it was still a climax community, and still more where it was in between. This ancient heterogeneity at scale is one of the reasons why Texas still has what's left of its amazing biodiversity today. Interestingly, the amplified fire regime really seems to have taken its toll on the coniferous forest types. Junipers are rather flammable but not very good at recovering from fires. This relegated what we call cedar breaks to the northern slopes of hills and removed a lot of juniper from mixed stands. This means that the virgin forests that we so commonly assume the Europeans encountered when they arrived in North America were not virgin at all. They had in fact been human-altered for about 10,000 years. Unfortunately, but predictably, the Europeans saw these forests as nothing more than a natural resource and nothing less than a nuisance. By 1600, many of the climax communities were being destroyed as European colonists often went after the largest trees first. The Europeans did not significantly change what was being done to the forests, but they did significantly change how fast it was happening. This accelerated speed became the norm, and groups would actually compete to see who could clear the land the fastest. With the growing European societies in North America, land clearing was done for agriculture and building supplies. But where ecosystem-based agricultural practices had been the norm for centuries in North America, the Europeans brought high-intensity agricultural practices that destroyed the soil. And where selective harvests were used, Europeans clear-cut entire stands. By the mid-1700s, significant portions of the climax communities in North America were gone. This land had been transitioned into agricultural fields which were annually plowed, replanted, and harvested. After several years of farming, both the seed bank and the nutrients of the soil had been completely lost. At this point, many farms were abandoned, but even then the forests did not return as they should have naturally with an intact seed bank. Fast-growing, economically unimportant pioneer species of trees became much more common due to their ability to colonize novel habitats and subsist on subpar soil. Between these farmlands, climax communities still existed for some time, but they became increasingly fragmented. Much like a fragmented hard drive, a fragmented forest is not nearly as functional as a contiguous forest. Forests have high humidity, low wind, and low light inside them. When fragmented, forests become significantly drier, windier, and brighter. Dryness and wind have obvious detriments, but when coupled with light, it can actually be detrimental to the plants because they are tricked into opening small holes called stomata in their leaves and transpiring out all their water so they can photosynthesize. Besides harvesting and fragmentation, the process of urbanization also accelerated in North America. Road building further fragmented habitats, building more edges. High-density settlements also brought their own host of problems, from soil compaction to runoff and pollution. Of course, all of these processes have now continued more or less unabated for centuries. Now that we know more about ourselves and our environment, we are able to see that humans and forests really have the same requirements. This is likely due to humans having evolved as a type of forest edge specialist ape, but it has resulted in human settlements throughout what is considered the forest belt in the United States. This is direct competition for space between trees and humans. Urbanization also has a host of other issues that affect trees. Some of those include urban heat island effects, which have become much larger problems in recent years. Soil compaction is also an issue that heavily affects trees. Trees cannot grow roots effectively in compacted soil and often suffer from it. And finally, pollution has significant effects on trees. Many pollutants dissolve directly into the living tissue of the tree, changing its chemistry. Other pollutants undergo what's called dry deposition on the leaves, which can block sunlight and clog pores, especially when produced in great numbers. Finally, soil and waterborne pollution in high enough quantities can kill roots or enter into the tree through them, thereby slowly poisoning the tree. All of these effects have been increasing since Europeans arrived in North America. Currently, 3.6% of the area of the United States is cities, but those cities hold 80% of the population. We lose 36 million trees across 175,000 acres every year. In the next 40 years, it's expected that we will transition a rural land area the size of Montana into urbanized land. So, trees and forests are suffering. And we really only build cities where trees and forests want to live. So what would happen if we tried to encourage the trees and forests to return to our urban centers? Now, people are beginning to realize that trees are not just the wood they are made from. Trees, especially living trees in the ground, provide myriad ecosystem services that make living around them easier. The canopy of a tree slows rainfall and prevents runoff. The roots allow this slowed rainfall to better infiltrate the soil. The leaves and roots clean the air and water respectively. The leaves and branches obscure sightlines and noise. The products trees make feed, shelter, and entertain us. Between windbreaks and shade, trees save homeowners millions of dollars annually. All told, trees actually provide nearly $20 billion of ecosystem services in the United States alone every year. Since we now know that trees make our city lives easier, a lot of effort has been made to understand our urban forests. Urban forests are different from rural forests because they are lower density and have fewer layers. Despite this, they offer more ecosystem services to people than rural forests due to their proximity to human life. Even though urban trees are important, they can be seen as more of a cost than a benefit. In development, trees are often viewed as a nuisance. This especially goes for larger trees with large critical root zones. Similarly, old and larger trees are often hazardous in some aspect. Trees develop cavities and flaws while they age, and that can create a significant danger in urban conditions. They can threaten homes, people, cars, or even right-of-ways. And while we remove trees often, they do not come back on their own often. Humans discourage regeneration through lawn care, leaf removal, since seeds are removed too, weeding, and compaction of the soil. That means we have a lot fewer young trees in cities than in rural areas. A lack of young trees means nothing will replace the old ones when they die. Nothing except people. And thankfully, people plant trees. But that means regeneration is curated, outsourced, and non-adaptive. Naturally, the offspring of trees living in an area would grow in the area, meaning they would likely be adapted to the specific conditions. Instead, now we bring in plants from elsewhere that often struggle in their new environment. The loss of larger urban trees and the ecosystem services they provide is what has led to a recent uptick in urban tree preservation. It is now recognized that young trees provide less services than old trees. So it has been codified into ordinance in most places that large trees must be protected. Large trees are also more of a risk due to their capacity to be dangerous, and their capacity to get in the way of the bulldozers of unscrupulous developers. Luckily, some groups have taken to transplanting large trees instead of removing them when they are in the way of development. Our admiration of large trees has led to the arborist industry and municipal urban forestry teams, in which trained professionals care for larger trees. This prevents a lot of tree loss from failures as flaws can be mitigated early. Unfortunately, this prevents a lot of standing dead wood, which, while inherently dangerous, is also an important habitat for many charismatic wildlife like raccoons and bluebirds. Honestly, the impressive tree ordinance in place in Austin that protect our urban forest are due in part to the hard work of one woman, Margaret Hoffman. Margaret Hoffman's love for our impressive trees has led to 2 protected size classes in Austin, protected trees and heritage trees. Protected trees are anything over 19 inches, and heritage trees are a certain subset of native species over 24 inches. In cases of trimming, work near the roots, or removal, applications must be submitted that are reviewed by arborists to make sure the tree will be hurt as little as possible, or there is no option other than removal. Even with all these protections, Austin is still losing trees as development and drought continue to threaten our forests. We have about 30% canopy coverage now, but our canopy is aging, and there are no replacements growing under them. The city of Austin does what they can to protect the urban forest, and the urban forestry program is very active within the Development Services Department. They are responsible for the tree ordinances and code enforcement. But best of all, Austinites are almost uniformly fans of trees. Tree Folk sees impressive levels of volunteerism, so much so that we have to turn people away often. We are also able to adopt out thousands of trees annually and plant tens of thousands in reforestation work. So hopefully, through our efforts and the goodwill of Austin area residents, we can actually turn the tide on deforestation. If we can increase our urban canopy, we will be able to provide ecosystem benefits like lowering the ambient temperature of Austin by 10 degrees. That's actually accomplishable. All we need to do is increase the urban canopy coverage by 10%. Then we hit the threshold where temperature reductions begin. So let's make Austin better for everyone and plant some trees. So with that, I would like to say thank you to everyone for listening, and if you'd like to learn more about Tree Folks, please visit us on Facebook or on our website, www.treefolks.org.